In a small room next to the pantry at the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town, on the 2nd of March, 1792, a post office opened for business. Letters were accepted between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, and the postman delivered the mail the next day. South Africa's oldest institution did not begin with ambition, it began with a room, a window, and a schedule. 233 years later, that institution is hopelessly insolvent, operating under business rescue, and relying on government money to open its doors each day. Its liabilities exceed its assets by approximately 8 billion rand. The promised funding that would have saved it has not arrived. The question of whether it can survive is no longer theoretical. This is the autopsy. The South African Post Office, known as SAPO, is not just a company. It is, by constitutional mandate, a universal service provider. That means it is legally required to provide postal access to every South African, including those in rural areas where no private courier has ever sent a driver. For most of its history, it fulfilled that mandate. It transported the Cullinan diamond from South Africa to London in 1905 as a normal recorded postal article. It introduced the first track and trace system in South Africa in 1994. It had a presence in almost every town and city in the country, more than 1,400 postal outlets at its peak. Its savings bank, Postbank, had more than 6 million customers, making it one of the largest banks in South Africa by customer number. In 2003, it launched the Paymaster to the Nation project, allowing social grant recipients to open a Postbank account and receive their money without needing a commercial bank. In 2004, it recorded its first operating profit. In 2007, MultiChoice used the post office as a distribution point for its share offer, an offer that was 3 times oversubscribed, with more than 125,000 citizens participating. The post office ranked among South Africa's top 25 employers that year. By 2013, it posted its last profit. Every year that followed was a loss. The deterioration did not happen in one event. It accumulated through a series of decisions and indecisions, each compounding the one before it. The global decline of traditional letter mail had been accelerating since the mid-2000s. Every major postal operator in the world was confronting the same challenge. The revenue model built on letters and registered mail was collapsing as email, mobile messaging, and digital transactions replaced paper communication. The operators that survived and rebuilt were the ones that pivoted into e-commerce, logistics, financial services, and government payment infrastructure. The South African Post Office identified those opportunities. The problem was not vision. The problem was execution, governance, and interference. In 2014, a strike lasting 4 months paralyzed the post office.
The board of post office must be held accountable because those people must report back to the board the development or the changes or the demand of the workers. They failed to defend the SASSA, SRD, that's point 1. So that post office must benefit from SRD, which is SASSA. We were paying 315 post office, they removed that, which it bring business to us.
In the last decade, the post office has lost billions in revenue due to a number of factors. These include the increase in private sector competition. Its failure to modernize and emulate world standards has further crippled the state entity.
Revenue dropped by 30% during that period. Customers who abandoned the service during the strike did not come back. They found alternatives, private couriers, digital payments, bank transfers, and they stayed there. The post office never fully recovered the volumes it lost in that single industrial action. That same year, private equity firm Ethos was acquiring AutoZone. The country's first major online retailers were establishing delivery partnerships with private couriers. E-commerce was growing. The post office's national branch network and its Postbank customer base gave it a structural position from which it could have competed. It did not. In the years between 2014 and 2016, the organization was run through a succession of leaders compromised by the procurement scandals that the public protector, Thuli Madonsela, would later document in a February 2016 report titled Postponed Delivery. Her investigation found that fees paid to labor brokers had reached 2.7 billion rand, with evidence of scope creep, overbilling, overcharging, and false billing resulting in what she described as runaway expenditure. She also found that a 161 million rand lease of SAPO's new headquarters in Centurion, signed in 2010, was tainted with corruption and irregularities and was unlawful. These were not allegations. They were findings by the public protector. The CEO in office in 2004, Monda Maniach, had been charged with fraud and tender mismanagement. His successor, Kutso Mempule, who served from 2005 to 2007, was removed after allegations of tender kickbacks. By the time a serious turnaround attempt began, years of financial extraction had already been baked into the balance sheet. Mark Barnes joined the South African Post Office as CEO in early 2016.
Mark Barnes, state of the Post Office in 30 seconds. What's your, if you were the president delivering a state of the nation, a state of the Post Office, what would you say?
I'd say this. I'd say we're on firm ground for the first time in many, many years. We don't owe the banks any money. We're not operating under a National Treasury guarantee, but we are still just operating at the right levels, but we haven't grown. So, we haven't invested in capital, but right now we're delivering at 89% of the UPU standard.
Which is what?
Which is 92%, so we're nearly there. We were down at 60% at some point. This has got a clear floor. What you see behind you is only 2 days post. We've got a clear floor here, guys, right? Clear floor. Okay,
there's an audience. There's an audience.
So we are operating functional and self-sustainable.
When he arrived, the organization had equity of 10 billion rand. By the time he resigned on the 1st of August, 2019, equity had grown to 16 billion rand, a 59% increase in 3 years. Barnes had a strategy. He wanted to make the post office an e-commerce and banking powerhouse. He saw the 6 million strong post bank customer base and the 1,400 branch national footprint as infrastructure that could not be replicated by any private competitor. He wanted to integrate Post Bank into the post office as a full-service banking offering, savings, unsecured loans, insurance, and credit for small businesses, delivered at scale through branches that were already present in every town the private banks had ignored. He believed the post office held commercially irreplaceable data and infrastructure. He resigned citing irreconcilable differences with the government over the future structure of the post office group, specifically over Post Bank. The government wanted Post Bank separated from SEPO as a standalone entity, citing risk and governance concerns. Barnes believed that without integration, neither entity could thrive. He left. In 2021, he and a consortium offered to buy 60 to 75% controlling stake in SEPO in order to rescue it. The offer was rejected. In the 3 years after Barnes left, SEPO's assets declined from 16 billion rand to 4.5 billion rand. Its liabilities climbed to a 6-year high of 12.4 billion rand by 2023. In those same 3 years, the post office missed its own annual revenue target by a country mile, generating 3 billion and 33 million rand against a target of 4 billion and 812 million rand. The gap between what the organization needed to generate and what it actually generated had become structurally unbridgeable. Measured in branch closures, the collapse began to show its shape in 2020. In the 2020 to 21 financial year, 22 branches were officially closed, 2 of them because landlords evicted SEPO for failing to pay rent. In 2021 to 22, 146 branches closed. In 2022 to 23, a further 122 were shut, including 58 that were consolidated into other locations. By July 2023, 316 branches had been closed since the start of 2020. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, South Africa had roughly 1,300 post office branches nationwide. The closures by mid-2023 represented close to a third of that footprint. On the 10th of July 2023, the High Court placed the South African Post Office under business rescue, superseding a provisional liquidation order that had been granted earlier that year after a creditor owed money for unpaid rent had successfully applied to court. Business rescue practitioners Anush Ruplal and Juanito Damons were appointed to manage the process. What they found when they assessed the organization's position was a liabilities figure of approximately 12.5 billion rand against assets of only 4.5 billion rand, a negative equity position of approximately 7.9 billion rand. The post office was not close to insolvent. It was, in the language of the practitioners, hopelessly insolvent. The business rescue plan was put to creditors in December 2023. It was adopted. Creditors were paid 12 cents in the rand. 4,342 employees were retrenched. The branch network was rationalized to 657 operational outlets. 7.4 billion rand in creditor debt was written back to the income statement. The plan required 2 tranches of government funding to work, 2.4 billion rand for stabilization and retrenchment packages, and a further 3.8 billion rand for the implementation of the full rescue. The first tranche was received. The R3.8 billion was not. In May 2025, National Treasury confirmed it would not provide further bailouts to SEPO. Between 2014 and 2023, the South African government transferred approximately 10.4 billion rand to the post office in bailouts and capital injections. That figure, documented by Corruption Watch, includes 7.9 billion rand paid between 2014 and 2019, and the 2.4 billion rand capital injection in 2023. It does not include the 3.8 billion rand that was promised as part of the business rescue plan and never arrived. In total, since 2014, the government allocated approximately 14.1 billion rand to the institution, money drawn from the national budget while schools went without textbooks, hospitals ran short of medication, and public infrastructure deteriorated. What the money did not buy was a functioning turnaround. The post office's own performance data for the quarter ending December 2023 showed it had achieved only 7% of its 15 key performance indicators. It was generating less than a third of its own revenue target, and it was still losing money. The bailout figure places SEPO within the broader catastrophe of South African state-owned enterprise mismanagement. By February 2025, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana confirmed that South African taxpayers had spent 520 billion rand bailing out state-owned enterprises over the preceding decade. The Post Office's 10.4 billion rand is a fraction of that number, but it sits alongside entities like South African Airways, Denel, Eskom, and Transnet as part of a pattern of institutional failure that has consistently extracted public resources without delivering sustainable public value. The human cost of SEPO's failure is most concentrated where the organization's social mandate was always most critical, the payment of SASSA grants to South Africa's most financially vulnerable citizens. SASSA distributes social grants to approximately 19 million people each month. These include the Older Persons Grant, the Disability Grant, the Child Support Grant, and several others. For decades, the Post Office, with its national branch network extending into rural areas that commercial banks have never served, was the primary physical distribution point for millions of those beneficiaries. When SEPO's branches began closing in volume from 2021, the impact was immediate and direct for people who had no alternative channel. By 2023, the civil society organization Black Sash documented that more than 900,000 grant beneficiaries were directly affected by SEPO's deteriorating ability to render services. At least 500,000 people collected their grants at post office branches. A further 150,000 were served by mobile cash pay points that were under threat of closure. Black Sash's monitoring documented specific post office branches that were unable to process grant payments due to connectivity failures and biometric authentication breakdowns, cash shortages, and security incidents so severe that one branch in KwaZulu-Natal stopped paying grants entirely following a series of hijackings. In June 2022, numerous branches across the country failed to process SASSA payments entirely. Beneficiaries who had arrived at 5 o'clock in the morning to secure a place in a queue in branches without toilets or running water were turned away. When Postbank officially took over the social grant payment system from SEPO in October 2022, the transition was supposed to be seamless. In December 2022, ATM access for Postbank SASSA Gold cards was suspended entirely following cybercrime attacks on Postbank systems. The instruction given to beneficiaries was to collect their grants at retail stores instead. Many of those stores ran out of cash. The system that was meant to protect the most vulnerable from the consequences of SEPO's failure failed them in the same month it went live. The Business Rescue Plan, as it was adopted in December 2023, envisaged a post office with 657 branches, approximately 5,000 employees, and an operational model no longer dependent on traditional letter mail volumes. The practitioners projected that reducing branches and staff to those levels would save approximately 1.3 billion rand in annual expenditure. To implement the transformation, investing in technology, infrastructure, and the modernization of services, the 3.8 billion rand second tranche of government funding was essential. The plan was written assuming that money would arrive. It did not arrive. 32 months into the business rescue process, the business rescue practitioners confirmed publicly that the 3.8 billion rand had not been received, despite it being binding on all affected parties under the terms of the adopted plan, including the government. The government's own minister had provided the assurance to the High Court under oath. The Portfolio Committee on Communications and Digital Technologies sought legal advice on whether the government was obligated to provide the funds. By early 2026, the practitioners stated plainly that time had elapsed, that the post office could only survive on the limited funds it had, and that without the promised money, the future of South Africa's oldest institution was drawing to a close. The workforce that was once close to 23,000 people had, by 2024, been reduced to fewer than 7,000 through retrenchments alone, with further cuts planned as the 235 additional branch closures announced in early 2024 proceeded. These retrenchments carry their own cascading cost, severance packages that the post office cannot fully fund from its own resources, medical aid obligations that went unpaid, with reports that it failed to pay contributions to the Medipose medical aid scheme since 2020, affecting 12,000 members and approximately 22,000 dependents, and pension fund contributions that remained in arrears.
I was owing 13,566 Medipose. I was admitted on the 11th of May in Landmet. Then Medipose didn't pay my bill. Each and every month as a worker, I am contributing. They are deducting my monthly contribution to the medical aid. So it's the post office fault that my medical aid is not paid. So they have to pay my medical aid so that they can settle my debt. I'm not going to pay that.
The business rescue practitioners have stated that the post office remains a strategically important state asset. Its physical network, its post bank customer base, its legal exclusivity over reserved postal services, and its position as the most extensive government-to-citizen delivery infrastructure in the country are real. They are not hypothetical. Barnes, who resigned in 2019 over how that infrastructure should be used, had argued in 2025 that a unified model, combining mail, e-commerce logistics, postal banking, and government payment services, remain viable if properly funded and allowed to operate without political interference. He believed the 6 million-strong post-bank customer base and the institutional branch footprint gave the post office an advantage that no private competitor could replicate from scratch. The government opposed the integration of Postbank and SEPA when Barnes proposed it. It separated the two entities. Postbank experienced its own technical failures and cybercrime losses. SEPA's network shrank. The window in which a modernization strategy could have been executed against a viable asset base passed. South Africa's oldest institution began in a room in the Castle of Good Hope with a postman and a schedule. 233 years later, the government that owns it has confirmed it will not provide the money that was promised to keep it alive. The business rescue practitioners are negotiating with potential private sector partners using an asset base that shrinks with every month the funding does not arrive. The branches that remain serve communities that have no alternative. The employees who remain do so inside an organization that has been technically insolvent for years. The asset is real. The failure is institutional. And the cost, in money, in jobs, in social grants delayed, and in rural communities left without a point of contact with the government that is constitutionally obligated to serve them, has fallen, as it always does in South Africa, on the people who could least afford to absorb it. This is the autopsy.